This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. Headlines. Today, that is an understatement. With an insurrection at the United States Capitol, mobs of pro-Trump thugs assaulted the U.S. Capitol and forced members of Congress into secure locations. Where are they? One Trump supporter demanded as crowds roamed the halls of the Capitol. The rioters demonstrated with Trump flags, Confederate flags, and MAGA hats as they pounded on doors, threatening elected members of Congress. Lawmakers, staff members, and more hid under tables, hunkered in lockdown, saying prayers and seeing the fruits of the country's division up close and violent. A woman was killed by police, and 3 others died in apparent medical emergencies. A Trump flag hung on the Capitol. The graceful rotunda reeked of tear gas. Glass shattered. In the end, the destruction was futile. Hours later, Congress still certified the election. What normally would be a ceremonial act ended in the early hours of Thursday morning, the certification of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, their election as president and vice president. More questions are on the agenda now about the last days of Donald Trump's White House. In a secured location is not a phrase often used to describe the whereabouts of members of Congress. Yet, across social media, people wanted to know who was safe. Representative Deb Haaland, Laguna Pueblo, posted a video saying she and her staff were safe in her office.
We'll stay put until they tell us it's safe to go out. Also wanted you to know, I am here today to affirm the will of the people and to fulfill my constitutional duty.
Representative Sharice Davids, Ho-Chunk, issued a news release this morning calling on the removal of Donald Trump. We will have a new president on January 20th, but we cannot trust Donald Trump to uphold his oath of office over the next 14 days. Our democracy, safety, and security is at stake, she said. The provisions of the 25th Amendment suspending a president can be initiated by the vice president and a majority of the cabinet, or by the vice president and a congressional committee. Representative Mark Wayne Mullen, Cherokee Nation, appeared on Good Morning America and insisted Donald Trump was not to blame. He said it was the media.
Say, as a country, we are better than this. And there is nobody to blame but ourselves when we start acting in that manner. There is no excuse and no one's to blame but ourselves. We need to take a hard look at our country. We need to take a hard look at the way we debate. We can agree to disagree, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. That doesn't mean I don't care for you. That doesn't mean I don't love this country any more or any less than you. But what we did yesterday was absolutely unexcusable.
We didn't do it. The mobsters did it. The rioters did it. The president encouraged it. But thank you for your time, Congressman.
Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, White Earth Nation, said, "What happened was un-American. Even during the Civil War, the Confederate flag never flew at the Capitol." She also warned that this behavior is contagious. She said, "As a mother, I'm struggling to explain what happened today to my 7-year-old. The terror that our elected representatives, their staff, and journalists covering democracy in action felt today is hard to comprehend. The choice in front of us is clear: to give in to division or to come together and rebuild our democracy." The lack of a law enforcement response at the Capitol leaves a lot of people wondering about double standards. Images of rioters taking selfies with Capitol Police are a stark contrast to the scenes so familiar, from Standing Rock to Mount Rushmore to the more recent Black Lives Matter. More than 760 arrests were made in North Dakota during the height of protests in 2016 and 2017. At times, thousands of pipeline opponents gathered in the region to protest a $3.8 billion project to move North Dakota oil to Illinois. And the effort didn't stop the project. Indian Collective CEO and President Nick Tilson, who was arrested during a rally against Trump's visit to the Black Hills in July, didn't hold back on Twitter. If these were Black, brown, and indigenous people, they would have killed us already. Read between the lines, people. Tilson is facing felony charges for his peaceful protest. For his part, President Donald Trump now says there will be an orderly transition on January 20th. But to give you an idea about how extraordinary that White House statement is, it could not be released by the president. His Twitter and Facebook accounts have been blocked for inciting the insurrection. Trump has spent the last 2 months refusing to concede the election and making baseless allegations of mass voter fraud. There are renewed calls for Trump to resign, be impeached for a second time by the Congress, or to be removed under the 25th Amendment. Yet in Washington, the peaceful transition of power has been marred by the events of this week. We'll be right back with a closer look at how police prepare for protests and what went wrong with the plan at the Capitol. As most Americans watched insurrectionists storm the United States Capitol yesterday, a lot of people wondered, where are the police? There were few barricades set up around the area, even though President Trump used social media to incite his followers to come to D.C. to protest the certification of the Electoral College vote. The insurgents pushed their way into Statuary Hall and then onto the floor of the House and even into the offices of U.S. representatives. How were they able to get so far without being arrested? Without the use of force even to disperse them? Joining us today, look at how law enforcement is trained to handle protesters, is Walter Lamar. For 18 years, he served as a special agent and supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. He also served as deputy director of the BIA, Office of Law Enforcement Services, and he has a remarkable career in law enforcement. Today, he's the president and CEO of Lamar Associates and provides law enforcement and security consulting services to tribal governments. Welcome, Walter.
Well, Mark, thank you for inviting me to your platform, which is the voice of Indian country, and it's absolutely a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. What was going through your mind as you watched all these events unfold yesterday?
Well, I think at the one of the things that with our native humor. I think the real breaking news here was the clown in the buffalo headdress. He was really something else or not. But it's, already, native Facebook is blown up with memes with this idiot all over it. But thank goodness we do have our humor. And yesterday was one of those days where it was so difficult to watch. And I watched it just like everybody else, slack-jawed, disbelieving, but the fact, as I watched it, because of my experience, and as you mentioned in the FBI and at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I served at the Department of Interior immediately subsequent to 9/11, and there I was working to protect the nation's dams, icons, and monuments. And in 2016, I went to work at the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, to protect the Pentagon. So I know exactly what physical security, what force protection is, and what we saw at the United States Capitol yesterday was not that.
Well, and I was wondering, kind of breaking it down two ways. One was, what was the plan? Who the planning involved beforehand? And then second, the execution. And it seems like it fell short on both areas. How do you think the planning started for all of this from afar?
Well, it's and interestingly enough, President-elect Biden yesterday in his message to the country referred to the Capitol as the citadel of democracy, the citadel of democracy, the icon of our democracy. And the fact that that Trump had already telegraphed what was going to happen by inviting these Trump thugs to DC, and then further inciting them, he and Giuliani with the rhetoric and with the rhetoric of violence, and the fact that they were telling them to march on the Capitol, that there are and the Capitol, the Pentagon, these revered institutions, they all have plans in place. They know how to control crowds. They know what physical security is. They know how to enact physical security. So the fact that there was no real planning yesterday, or sadly, there could have been, and that planning was simply to give ground and give way and allow them to take control of the citadel of democracy. That's the part that is most troubling. And when you watch those videos and the videos that are circulating around, where on the east side of the Capitol, where it's almost as if they just invited them on in. And there's even troubling video with one of the Capitol Police taking a selfie with a rioter, with a Trump thug. I mean, it just is. I mean, to see how easily that they moved into the Capitol is contrary to all of the industry best practices. And when you look at it, what you look at it in a very simplistic way is concentric circles of protection. So at the Capitol, they have on the outer boundaries, they have these plastic fences. And what those are is simply a line of demarcation. And what that does is it says to law-abiding, personally responsible citizens, do not go past this line of demarcation, this fence. Now, it's not going to keep anybody out who wants to go past it. But once they go past it, now they have signaled that they're no longer personally responsible, a law-abiding citizen, that they're already willing to threaten the Capitol, correct? So then what needs to follow is then an inner perimeter. And now that's going to be either steel barricades along with personnel. And they're going to work to try to hold that. And when we talk about, and we're seeing obviously a lot of parallels to Standing Rock, to the racial justice protests that occurred here in DC, where tear gas was immediately used, pepper spray, batons, arrests, Standing Rock, that, over the period of time there, 760 some arrests over a 2-day period here in DC. And the racial justice protest, 427 or so arrests. Yesterday, there was barely a handful of arrests. So when you look at that, you say, well, that inner perimeter would have held. And then you talk about rules of engagement. And then you also talk about a continuum of force. That continuum of force is verbal commands is where it starts, and where it ends is deadly force. So they use verbal commands telling people you can't come any further. Well, there was none of that yesterday. We saw none of that. And so when you then the inner perimeter was there, and there was one and it got breached, well, then that personnel, they move in tighter to the building, and then they have a determination that they will give no ground, that nobody will get inside the Capitol. And when you think about yesterday, we had in terms of national security, we had the vice president, we had the Speaker of the House. I mean, we had the successors to the president in line are there in the Capitol. And yet the force was not used to protect that building and keep folks out. And the fact that there was a Confederate flag marching around inside the Capitol, it just, today I feel, and my wife just said it, she said, I feel shell-shocked.
Well, and as Representative Sharice Davids pointed out in a tweet, even during the Civil War, the Capitol never had a Confederate flag flying in it. This is really extraordinary in terms of that history. I was thinking about your concentric circles, and I covered the first time I experienced this was covering the riots at the WTO in Seattle. And I saw how the concentric circles formed and how they just started narrowing them. And last night, I was struck by how they were doing exactly that when they were clearing the Capitol. But then those concentric circles, when they got smaller, they didn't arrest anybody. And I remember seeing at WTO, all the buses lined up and the circles would get smaller and you would be in one of those circles and you'd be taken away with the plastic handcuffs. And this didn't seem to have that seriousness of purpose.
Well, and when you look at physical security, and I always like to refer to it as force protection, but in force protection, you have gates, guards, locks, alarms, lighting, and access control. And so those are all tools, and that's the security tools. But once those security tools break down, then it becomes a law enforcement function. And you're exactly right. That's when people start getting arrested. That's when you see all these videos with these idiots carrying out podiums and carrying out souvenirs and breaking through windows. And on my initial assessment, as I looked at this thing, I thought, probably none of these Trump thugs were thinking that morning when they woke up that they would end up inside the Capitol of the United States. They probably, like a lot of us, believed there was a protective barrier that would prevent that. But nonetheless, you saw one of them. There was one of the national videos going out with a guy with a 3-foot crowbar beating in the glass windows. So clearly, they were prepared to cause damage. The fact that they came to town and how many weapons were taken, firearms were taken away from them at the Capitol. So now you have this armed insurgency inside the building that have, it just boggles my mind. And to see these people in the Senate well, on the dais, sitting in the leader's chair with their feet kicked up. When we talk about security, we're talking about protecting people, we're talking about protecting property, but we also are looking at protecting, to a lesser degree, our reputational integrity. We have a reputation across the world as this democracy, this bastion of democracy, and yet we look like rank amateurs with these nitwits running through the Capitol, and it almost gets speechless talking about it. And I said this morning when I realized that we're going to be talking on this interview, I'd do everything I could to keep from cursing, but it drives it to that. Trust me.
We only have about a minute left, but I want to just get a hint of what's next for the rioters. What would be the legal process going forward?
Here's what I think is more important than that is we in Indian country have to take this as a signal. We got to look at that hate and that violence that was demonstrated yesterday, white supremacists, white nationals, domestic terrorists, and we have to take that as a signal to be on our awares and be on the lookout and be monitoring that kind of hate, because trust me, they'll see us in their sights at some point.
Wow, that's powerful. Walter Lamar, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
We'll be right back. Jacqueline Keeler is a Dene and Dakota journalist based in Portland, Oregon. She's editor-in-chief of Pollen Nation magazine, and she is the author of the upcoming book, Standoff, Standing Rock, the Bundy Movement, and the American Story of Sacred Lands. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
The story yesterday on Capitol Hill seemed to me to have roots in Oregon, and perhaps even more so than Donald Trump, the insurgency of the Bundy family. It represents this narrative strain that's part of America.
Yeah, I think I took 4 years to finish my book about it was originally supposed to be a book about Standing Rock, but I had to include my coverage of the Bundy takeovers here in Oregon, because that's how I started out in January 2016, was covering that for Indian Country Day, and then ended it in December at Standing Rock, and really I noticed at the time the huge contrast in the sort of the response, and by the sheriffs of each county particularly, and the very strong military response to an unarmed, nonviolent protest by water protectors at Standing Rock versus that of an armed protest at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge here in Oregon. And so I guess, I have to be honest that I was expecting this month. Maybe not this soon to this extent, but I was expecting something like this, and having studied these groups for 4 years now.
Well, the first time I remember that parallel was in Nevada with the Dan sisters on one hand and how they were treated versus the Bundys just a few 100 miles away with same type of issues, but yet the government's response was so different. And this was played out on a larger stage, that same issue.
Well, yeah, I definitely, in my book, I ended up, in order to compare the two different standoffs, right? The book is called actually Stand is that I compared the two families involved, and two families. One, my grandmother's family, her cousin Vi Deloria Jr. and her aunt Ella Deloria, the kind of writing and thinking that in philosophy and historical context of Standing Rock, right? Versus my great aunt Ella was raised in Standing Rock, and my grandmother's cousin Vine Deloria Jr. was a tribal citizen there. And so the philosophies that grew out of that experience of occupation, of everything that happened to the Great Sioux Nation, versus that of the Bundys. And that's what I spent 4 years looking at the history of that. And it really is embedded in American history. And also, I should say, surprisingly, when they're talking, a lot of the different slogans they're using, like enclosure of the land, of the commons, this all comes actually out of the English Civil War. And so what is so American about this? And I would say Trump is the ultimate colonial leader, right? Because I make a point in my book that the United States, and I give a lecture about this as well, is a colony still. It's a colony in function, if not in overt stated form, right? It calls itself a nation state. It calls itself a country. This is their homeland, but they're actually a colony and colonists occupying other people's homelands. And so I think when you use this paradigm to understand what's going on, it makes it much more clear the really very strong response to the election. You know, for so many centuries in this country, the vote was really held by a very, very small group of Americans. It was particularly in the very beginning with, landed people who own land. And certainly Jefferson's idea of democracy was of a landed gentry type of, or, actually a yeoman farmer, possibly more, which was a complete impossibility in England, where most of the land has been owned by centuries, basically by the descendants of William the Conqueror and his buddies. And it's shocking, even to this day, most of the land in Britain, in England, and in Scotland, and in Wales is owned by this ruling class that have ruled for over 1,000 years, about 3/4 of it. And so it's, the ability to have land was impossible in their homeland, but here they had the dream, county by county, marching across our continent and transforming what they could not have in England here. And I note in the book that the surname Bundy refers to bound servitude, where they would, the old feudal allegiance to a lord, which then became serfdom, where the Bundys were actually bound to the land. And when a lord inherited the land, they inherited the Bundys with it. And so it's this. So it's and I have to say that this kind of violence, I'm actually really concerned about Deb Haaland, because the changes that have occurred under the Bureau of Land Management under Trump were, I think, are viewed by this same group, these rural right-wing sort of armed groups, as being really important victories, including the sort of the movement of the Bureau of Land Management offices to their vicinity, to these rural areas, so that they can impose their will on those agencies, right? And if she undoes a lot of the victories they feel they have managed to gain under Trump, there will be, I think, a violent response. Not to overstate it, and not because I want her to be safe, but it is a really because she has such oversight over their communities, there will be conflict, and this is. I don't think this is going to end and go away, because this is so fundamental to how the country was occupied, how power is divided, and the agreements that already exist. And of course, these are very much, been sort of determined by a system of white supremacy. So yeah, this is a natural outcome. People who haven't been paying attention, and I think this is why the indigenous perspective on these issues is so valuable at this time, because we provide a third way of looking at this issue that is often lost, and actually provides a lot more context because of our connection to the land.
The challenges, I think you're absolutely right, the Bureau of Land Management and the challenges with that. And it's almost going to have to be, they should begin planning on how that change is going to occur right now, because it's almost going to be too late when some of the decisions are made because of the issues involved that you raise.
Yeah, I think, of course, she hasn't been confirmed, and not to speak out of turn, but yeah, but it's I am very concerned about that, and because they are trying to, I go into the book about county supremacy, which I mentioned before, is this ideology that in the county level, the sheriff is the supreme authority, even over the president of the United States and Congress, right? And this they have a whole ideology, which I examine in my book, which emboldens them, which gives them permission to act this way. And you will see that none of them feel embarrassed about it. I think some Republican leadership is backing off now because it has gone farther than, but of course they helped create the situation.
Well, thank you so much, Jacqueline Keeler. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
And that's our slice of the Indigenous world today. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with another edition of Indian Country Today tomorrow. I'm Mark Trahant.
You got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing Rock.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.